Okay, so welcome everybody. We have Marjorie St. Clair here live from Hawaii for her book launch. And we've got her book here. It's a pleasure to have Marjorie here today. And I know a lot of you know her from when she used to live in Albuquerque and now she's living in Maui. And I'm going to be reading what I wrote for the blurb for her book. And Marjorie's going to be reading 5 short excerpts from the book, and you can follow along if you like. And then we're going to follow with a Q&A. So use the chat if you have comments as we're going on. That's great. And then later, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we will have a chance to talk about Marjorie's writing process and her very interesting life. So Marjorie joins us live from her home in Hawaii to read and talk about her latest book, her memoir, A Southern Belle in Paris, Bikinis, Bombs, de Beauvoir, and Billy Bob. Marjorie reflects on being a young beauty pageant winner, military wife, and mother of 2 from the Deep South. After a move to France, she becomes part of the emerging feminist movement in Paris in the 70s. And then she tells her resistance to the patriarchy through humorous, authentic, riveting stories. And then she returns as a steel magnolia to Alabama to complete a divorce and start a new life. For all women seeking a strong, independent voice, this memoir is an avenue for their voices to be heard. And Marjorie is also a writing teacher, coach, writing retreat leader, helping women find their unique voice through writing, and she encourages them to publish. She has authored and published 2 writing workbooks, and then this memoir. And I'd also like to acknowledge Denise Weaver-Ross, who is here with us also, who did the cover design. So thanks, Denise. So welcome, Marjorie.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, just a word on Denise. She's done the covers for all my books, actually. And they're awesome because Denise is a great artist and great designer. So, Denise, thank you. Couldn't do it without you, that's for sure.
Marjorie, it's been lots of fun.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you're still feeling that.
Yes,
It's always a process, especially since I moved to Hawaii and was doing this all online. I mean, it's not like we could meet up for coffee and look at things in the hard copy. Anyway, I wanted to say welcome to everybody who's here. Most everybody I know, not everybody, but a lot of you I know from classes or just from friends in Albuquerque, or we have a few other people who might be joining us from Paris, whom I knew in the feminist group, as they say, back in the day. In my case, really back in the day. So just thank you to Jules and John for doing this hosting thing, because it's a big deal, and I don't think I could have done it without them for sure, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Then I also want to thank people who read the draft and gave their feedback. Kate is here. She read it and gave me feedback, and which meant I had to write another draft. There was so much feedback. Thank you, Kate. And Andy Penner was also someone who read and helped me out quite a bit. Others of you wrote reviews, and I'm really appreciative of that. But anyway, like they say, it takes a village to raise a child. And your book, when you're writing, it's like your child, and it does take a village to help you along the way, to realize when things aren't clear, to realize, oops, you skipped, in my case, it took me about 5 years before I could include my ex-husband in the memoir. It's like, and people who read it, my beta readers said, well, who is this guy named Saren? You just said you were married to somebody, but you didn't tell anything else about him. And that's difficult sometimes if you didn't have like the most awesome divorce in the world or whatever that made you go apart. Anyway, I did finally have the courage to include him, and he's in there now. He'll never read it, but whatever. So thank you all very, very much. And I am going to get to it. The first excerpt I'm going to read is on page 11, and it sort of sets the stage for, you know, where I was from, and what the environment was like for a young girl in the Deep South, and still is. I feel pretty. Is there anything to the notion of a Southern belle, or is it simply an archetype popularized by such female characters as Scarlett O'Hara and Melanie Wilkes in Gone with the Wind? For a girl growing up in the South, being pretty and catering to men had roots as far back as the 1800s, decades before the Civil War. In the period known as the antebellum South, respectable women from the wealthy class began to present themselves with a particular look. The look for the belle, a French word meaning beautiful, meant she would always walk underneath a parasol to ensure not a ray of sun would darken her fair skin. She wore a hoop skirt, hat, and gloves, and a whalebone corset to slim her waist to under 20 inches. A Southern belle became the epitome of a genteel woman. She would have received classes in proper locution, meaning how to speak in a pleasing manner, how to write in a beautiful handwriting style for all those proper invitations to balls and receptions she'd be writing in her own delicate hand once she married. She'd also possess a reasonably good singing voice or the ability to play a few religious hymns on the piano. Those were the minimum qualification to ensure her being a desirable candidate for marriage to someone of good standing and with good prospects of acquiring more wealth. In the 50s and 60s, when I was growing up, the only vestiges remaining of debutantes and social balls were in the older pre-Civil War towns such as Macon, Savannah, and Atlanta. My hometown wasn't even a town until after World War II, when the Air Force built an air base and the town grew up around it. It was a town of working class and middle class folks. None of us girls called ourselves or were referred to by others as Southern belles. There were no debutante balls or cotillions. Rather, we were just girls wanting to wear lipstick, get our ears pierced, and own a record player so we could play our 45 RPM records of our favorite pop singers, such as Pat Boone. As quaint or ridiculous as these ideas might seem now about women and Southern belles and the whole rigmarole around getting a good man to marry you, I want to be clear. To a good number of Southern folks, these still carry a lot of sway, and the popular debutante balls of the past are still a thing. Being a sweet, pretty girl mattered a long time ago, and to some, it still does. In the year of our Lord, 1960, it mattered a lot to me. By the time I was a senior in high school, I had entered and been a finalist in several beauty contests, setting me firmly onto one of only several paths that pretty white Southern girls were allowed to follow: wife, mother, or teacher. So that's the South. Didn't even mention religion. That's a whole other thing that is a whole other thing. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, so the next thing I want to read is, so I married a military officer and we started moving around all over the world. And our second assignment, and I had one baby who was 6 months old, a son. And we moved to Kwajalein, which is in the Marshall Islands, or Micronesia, so literally in the middle of nowhere. So I was 20 with one baby and expecting another baby, and really just growing up and trying to figure out what the world was all about. And shocked by living in a culture where people worshipped sharks and stones, and it's like, oh my God, they're all going to hell. So it was very challenging, and I was learning a lot. And one of the things, this was a hard chapter for me to do an excerpt from, because I felt like, well, I just felt like it was just really, really a key thing, not just for me and my family, which it was for my baby daughter, but the fact that it was mostly hidden from the world. And we'll talk, I'll read a little bit about that. So this is the chapter, page 51, Bikinis, Bombs, and Babies. Just want to send a shout out to Paul, who was the one who suggested that title. Paul, you can talk about that later. He was inspired, and so was I. So I owe this title to Paul. So when I become a millionaire, Paul, I'll share some of that with you. And Denise, of course. Bikinis, Bombs, and Babies. I've got some exciting news, Chaplain Tinker said to me one Sunday after I'd been directing the chapel choir for a few months. We've been invited to visit Ebi by the Marshallese choir director, who wants to collaborate with us for a joint choir concert. This was exciting news, since residents from Kwajalein were forbidden to visit the small nearby island of Ebi, which was home to the Marshallese natives. We boarded one of the flat-bottomed boats that brought the Marshallese to and from Ebi to Kwajalein every day. After a short ride, the boat docked at Ebi's harbor, where we stepped out onto a dirt road that ran directly through the middle of the village, with houses bordering on either side. As we walked down the muddy dirt road, I soon realized that the houses were nothing more than flimsy structures made of cardboard, pieces of tin, and wooden boards nailed together with holes left for windows and doors. Pigs, skinny dogs, chickens, and naked brown children were running everywhere. Garbage and refuse were strewn on the street and in the yards. As I gazed at the poverty and the squalid living conditions, I felt myself becoming nauseous. As I looked more closely, I realized that many of the children and adults were crippled and had deformities I had never seen. Many of these children and adults got polio a few years ago, the chaplain said, seeming to read my mind. Officials believe that someone from Ebi was exposed to a carrier on Kwajalein and took it back to the village, where it quickly spread throughout the entire island atolls. Well, what about the polio vaccine? I asked, still trying to comprehend what I was seeing. They didn't get vaccinated until after the outbreak, but by then it was too late. Many islanders died or were crippled and maimed for life. Well, what about her and that little boy next to her? I asked, nodding in the direction of two young children standing near one of the dilapidated houses. What happened to them? Can polio cause such deformities? Well, their deformities are from the radiation fallout many of the population suffered after the extensive nuclear testing the United States military did here a few decades ago. A lot of babies born to mothers who suffered from radioactive fallout were born with no arms and no legs. I smiled and waved to the deformed young children who smiled and waved back with knobs where arms should have been. What do you know about radiation fallout? I asked Saren later that evening after I'd returned from eBay. Radiation fallout? Yes, from nuclear bombs the military exploded here for years after World War II. The fallout from those explosions made a lot of the islanders sick, and mothers are still giving birth to babies that are severely deformed. You should have seen some of those children with no arms that I saw today on eBay. I don't think those deformities are due to radiation fallout, he said, with a certainty born from a creed and devotion to the military as the only practical way to keep peace. The military is really careful in how they conduct nuclear tests, and if it hadn't been for those tests, well, it put us ahead of the rest of the world in building up a stronger military force than anyone else. Everything we're doing here now is a direct result of how successful we've been in the past. We need our large arsenal of military weaponry to keep us safe, to keep the world safe. Now, some 20 years later, after those tests, our family, we found ourselves living in the same toxic environment and potentially suffering from its effects, just as the native islanders had suffered for decades. No one at the time seriously connected our baby Marie's breathing difficulties shortly after her birth to the extensive radiation fallout from nuclear testing done in the area that might still be present in the coral dust. But when we returned stateside, as her baby teeth began to come in, they were the color of gray dishwater. When tested for allergies, she was so highly allergic to numerous foods and environmental pollens that she had to suffer weekly injection for many years. Earlier in the book, I talk about how the baby and I had to be air evacuated from Kwajalein because she couldn't breathe or had great difficulty in breathing. Okay, so we skip a bunch of chapters to the next excerpt, which is called Feminism and Now in Paris, page 133. So my then husband was on a career path to become a general, and he was doing quite well in that category, I guess. And so, you know, he knew a lot of people, and we got the cherry assignment of Paris, to where he was head of the NATO liaison office to France. So he became stellar in that area, and I became a feminist. You can already write that script, right? But I'll read a little bit of this chapter. Feminism and Now in Paris. After getting the kids off to school, I poured myself another coffee and opened the International Herald Tribune, the only newspaper that reported the news in English. As I leafed through the newspaper, I noticed an ad announcing a meeting for anyone interested in forming an English-speaking feminist group in Paris. It was being called by Lucy Commissar, a journalist from New York and vice president of National Now, the National Organization for Women. I remembered the sociology professor at New Mexico State University who told us that feminism was a movement started by women who wanted to be treated equally and fairly as their male counterparts. And while I liked that idea, I wondered if there was an actual need for an organization to bring that about. Still, I was interested in learning more and wanted to attend the meeting. I didn't think Saren would mind if I went. Sometimes he could be surprisingly flexible. As usual, the left bank was crowded and students and tourists, but I found a spot to park not far from the meetup at the American Cultural Center. I was surprised to see that there was a line of women stretching around the entire block waiting to get in. Once inside, it was so packed that Lucy Commissar often had to repeat herself. We listened intently as Commissar shared how the women's rights movement of the 1960s had grown out of a second wave of activism as a result of the convergence of numerous popular events. I'm not going to go into that. It takes too much time, but going on sort of to the end of that, within a few months' time after that meeting, my good friend Elaine and I would become a part of a core group of 8 women and 1 man who met regularly to organize and build a structure for the determined and committed English-speaking women from the countries of Sweden, Norway, Brazil, England, Italy, Mexico, and Belgium, as well as Americans living in Paris who wanted to engage in feminist dialogue and action. So that's the how I got involved in N.O.W in Paris. 2 more excerpts, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So this is an excerpt from page 193. It's called Lilith and Eve, a New Story of Sisterhood. So my mother and aunt, both steel magnolias, visited us in Paris. And as kind of a tease, I asked them if they would like to go to a feminist meeting with me, and never thinking that they would agree to go, but they did. And I was thrilled because I thought, oh, you know, this is just going to give me more opportunities to show them how narrow their perspective is and how outdated everything they think is. Well, it was a setup for sure. So here we go. For our feminist meeting, we had rented a large room in Paris's rundown working class district, which fed the illusion for some that we were part of the workers' revolution, which clearly most of us were not, and that we were supporters of the idea of a new economy focusing on downward mobility, which clearly, again, most were not. This diversity of women's political and social views in our group, however, was only one of the main problems I'd written about in an article called Difficulties in Starting a N.O.W Chapter in a Foreign Country. This article was published in the handbook distributed to attendees at the first International Feminist Planning Conference at Harvard that I, along with hundreds of other women from around the world, had just attended. Once we arrived at the meetup site, I helped Mother and my aunt get settled in chairs at the back of the room, while others on the program helped to get everything ready for the meeting. One of our members, a practicing psychotherapist, was going to lead the psychodrama for the group after I'd given my report about the feminist conference at Harvard. As the meeting was starting, I noticed a few new women who had entered with one of our Latin American members. They sat off to the side in the back near my mother and aunt. Our meetings had settled down a lot, but were still somewhat on the chaotic side, although this one had gone smoothly at first, and I even got to give my entire report on the Harvard conference. But the calm was definitely one that precedes a storm. As the therapist stood to announce the psychodrama, one of the new women sitting in the back suddenly stood up and in a loud, booming voice announced that she'd just arrived from Amsterdam, where she'd been working in the streets as a prostitute. You women know nothing about my life and the issues of real women like me who have to use our bodies to earn a living, she exclaimed. An audible gasp went up around the room. I've been living on the streets of Amsterdam for years now. I suck cocks, large and small. The cost is the same. I fuck in alleys and filthy rooms, use dildos or whips, front or rear penetration. Cost still the same. There's plenty of women like me, and we're constantly getting vaginal disease and anal lacerations for all the fucking we do for a living. Once you're in this world, there's little chance that you're going to make it out. Several lesbians spontaneously jumped up and joined in the diatribe to convince the obviously distressed woman that her problem was due to her having fallen victim to heterosexual propaganda that had fostered her addiction to masturbating herself with the male penis. What you need, Arlette said, is a woman lover who will treat you with respect and give you all the good loving you deserve. Caroline and I will demonstrate, she said, motioning for her partner to stand up, and they began kissing and caressing one another. See, Arlette said to the woman from Amsterdam, we don't violate one another, and female being with another female is completely satisfying. You don't need a male penis, you've just been brainwashed. Suddenly, the evening's agenda had taken on a life of its own, and soon the entire group was participating in a spontaneous, real-time psychodrama. There was hardly a woman present who eventually didn't have something to say to the by now overwhelmed woman from Amsterdam. Personally, I was so thrown off guard that I couldn't speak, especially since my mother and aunt from Georgia and Alabama were sitting in the back of the room. What had been an initial effort on my part to embarrass and humiliate them had totally backfired, and I had egg on my face. Okay, that's one of our meetings in Paris. Can read the rest of that, what happened. So then skip over to the last excerpt, which takes place in Alabama after I've left Paris and where I've gone to get a divorce. Page 271, the Steel Magnolia meets Billy Bob. So here we get to find out who Billy Bob is. 271. Come on in, Miss Bean, and meet your co-host, Billy Bob, the program director Buzz said, inviting me into his office on the first day of work at the television station. Since I had never watched the morning show that I would be co-hosting with Billy Bob, I had no idea what he looked like. There, sitting on the edge of Buzz's desk, like a rooster on his perch, sat Billy Bob, decked out in cowboy attire with cowboy boots and a cowboy hat to finish off the look. Barely able to contain my shock, I walked over and we shook hands while he gave me the up and down, once over look. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. My co-host was a thank God I'm a country boy, guitar picking, Alabama born and bred redneck. First week, you'll be observing your co-host, Billy Bob, Buzz said as I sat comatose in the chair underneath a mounted deer head hanging directly above me. It was a Daniel in the lion's den moment of knowing that, unlike Daniel, this wasn't going to end well for me. From the moment Buzz introduced us, guitar-picking Billy Bob hated my guts. For over a decade, he'd been filling up the early morning television airways in the northern part of Alabama and southern Tennessee with his 2-hour show featuring his circle of cronies and other good old southern guitar-picking boys. Billy Bob was outraged that the television suits were treating him without the dignity he deserved. Hiring a woman who was one of those feminist weirdos to do the show with him? He, Billy Bob, who'd been the big name at the station for over a decade? How could y'all do this to me? He had asked, having stormed into the manager's, Mr. Dempsey's office after Buzz had broken the news to him. It was no surprise then that in less than a week's time on the set observing Billy Bob, we were all sitting together again in Mr. Dempsey's office with cigarette ashes dropping on white shirts and bad ties. The big bosses carefully and forcefully outlined the reasons to Billy Bob for their strange and otherwise unfathomable action. Nobody watching your show, Billy Bob. The advertisers are dropping like flies and don't want to sponsor you no more. You're all news, done, worn out. Nobody likes your music and guitar playing anymore. Bottom line is, this show ain't making us money. You either do the show with Miss Bean or you got the highway. Nobody ever said those good old boys aren't tough sons of bitches. I didn't know what to say as I watched the scene unfold, so I just sat still and said nothing, knowing I was watching a facsimile of the War of Titans, Southern style. Billy Bob and I got to choose the guest whom we would interview, 50-50. We weren't 2 days into the new show with me as his co-host when our differences exploded. I had invited the sole woman on the Huntsville police force to come and demonstrate self-defense techniques for women. Before I could relish the thrill I felt that such great information to help women defend themselves was being sent out over the airways, Billy Bob jumped in. I don't reckon a woman would be needing any of that self-defense stuff if she didn't dress in those mini skirts girls are wearing these days. A girl's asking for it if she dresses like a prostitute. My policewoman and guest and I, mind you, the cameras are rolling since it was a live show. We were shocked. We were speechless. When I snapped to my almost forgotten warrior woman, now having taken on the persona of a Southern steel magnolia, kicked into high gear and verbally set into my Alabama redneck host, Billy Bob, with a vengeance. Nobody says anything about men when they wear those ridiculous tight-ass polyester pants and strut down the street like peacocks, I said, emphasizing the cocks and peacocks. Nobody accuses them of wanting some, do they? No, they do not. Women should be able to wear anything they want without the threat of rape or verbal abuse from pistol-toting, ignorant male chauvinist pigs. And furthermore, I think you owe the police officer and myself an apology. Then the yelling began. Cut to commercial, the show's director yelled. Then more yelling on the set, which had by now become a scene of total chaos. It was a call-in show, and suddenly the phones lit up like a Christmas tree. During the extra long commercial break, we got enough control of ourselves to finish the show. The moment the show ended, the director called out over the studio set, Billy Bob and Miss Bean, you're both wanted in the manager's office. I knew they were going to fire me, but I didn't care. Billy Bob deserved all he'd gotten from me, and I would take nothing back. So that's Billy Bob. So that's it. For the
Yay, Marjorie. Let's get it. And you have to tell us, for those, well, I guess you'll have to read the book to see who got fired. You or
Yes,
Billy Bob.
yes.
But do you want to
might
tell
not
us?
be who you expect. Might not be who you expect. Yeah. All right. Well, Q&A, yeah?
I'm going to put us up here, adding to the spotlight. I'll also put John up here. Yeah, well, first of all, feel free to unmute yourselves and give Marjorie a hand. That was a wonderful reading. And you have a great sense of humor and very powerful.
Bravo.
And feel free to put something in the chat as well if you have a question. And then just because we're recording, I'm kind of doing this for a spotlight, but Marjorie, it's just a joy to hear you read, and your writing and your dialogue, and how you just have those excerpts with your memoir. I know it can be hard to choose things for when you're writing about your life, and you have these very kind of compact stories in very different things. So it's hard to know where to begin, but I guess, and I really like that you were always asking questions, and you really transformed your life from a Southern Belle into a steel magnolia.
Is there anybody who doesn't know what a steel magnolia is? It's a phrase. It's a phrase used to denote a woman who is very forthright and speaks her mind, often in a very soft way, but she'll kill you in a moment if she doesn't like what you're doing or saying. So it's an interesting term. It's an archetype, much like the Southern Belle, but really you don't mess with a steel magnolia.
So I'd like to ask, the whole topic of memoir, and Andy Penner has a question here. When did you start writing? What drew you to memoir? And I guess I would also ask, how long have you been working on this? But what prompted you to write your memoir?
Well, I don't know. I really don't know, but it started out to be, it was going to be a book on Mary Magdalene. I know that's weird, but that's where it started. And it just metamorphed into the story of Marjorie. And I took an outline of what it was, what I thought it might be, to the first Maui Writers Conference here, because I was living in Maui at that time. And I think it's interesting in that, so at the conference, you could, you pay a little money and you get a superstar to critique your work and talk to you. So I got some young whippersnapper from Hollywood. I don't even remember what his claim to fame was, but he was so bloody insulting. And it was like, well, you're kind of old. Of course, then I wasn't old. I mean, I wonder what he'd say now. But anyway, it's like, well, you think I'm old and too old to write? So, he was not encouraging. It's kind of like, why does anybody like you, who's basically nobody, want to write a memoir? Who are you to write a memoir, kind of a thing? And that's how it used to be with memoir, only famous people, who, were influencers, we'd call them today, would write their story or have a ghostwriter write it. So that began to shift, I guess about 10 years ago. And that's when I started changing things around in my story. And the first beta readers I had, who were women on my doctoral committee, who were very generous with their help. And like I said in the beginning, one of them just kind of really blasted me. She said, well, who is this guy that you married? You just say you married, you don't say anything. He's missing. You can't write a memoir and let your husband and then ex-husband be missing. You're going to have to talk about him. It's like, oh my God, I can't talk about him. he's still alive and his children are still alive. What will, and if I do talk about him, can I say really, what an asshole he was? I mean, so I struggled for years, honestly, with that, how to include him. And really, it did take me that long to make peace and not be like a victim and, rewrite those stories, hopefully, that, are about him and me in a more balanced, because I was, come on, somebody who becomes a feminist and you're trying to become a general in the army. I mean, it was very challenging for him. At first, he thought, oh, isn't that sweet? She's become a feminist. I mean, we would go to these big shindigs in Paris, and he would like, oh, this is my wife. She's a feminist. It's like, well, that didn't last long, because you could say she's a feminist, but then when the feminist starts doing things, it's a whole different story.
Yeah.
So anyway, so in working with women mostly now who are writing their memoir, it is very difficult to talk about those difficult times, and especially people who've hurt you, and how much do you want to say about it? So you've got to be ready to take it all in. I know Mary Carr, when I heard an interview of her a couple of years ago, Mary Carr, who wrote The Liars Club, and, a bestseller from Texas, she is. Anyway, she said, don't do it. Don't write a memoir unless you have to. And then recently, Amy Tam, who wrote her memoir, she also said, this was the most difficult out of all the books I've written. This was the most difficult, because you have to open yourself up, and you got to kind of tell the truth. And nobody wants to read a revenge story, however, like right. He did this and he did that or whatever. So it really requires, in my opinion, and certainly in my experience, that you have come to some sort of balance with what happened, and not be like, not be all up and hateful, I guess I would say.
Yeah, you made peace with it, like you said. And I think that's a really important point, because it's not like a revenge. I mean, there's a lot of horrible things that happen, but you have partly a sense of humor, but it's like you're looking back now and you can see that transformation, but yet you still have the stories and how difficult it was or what you went through.
So in a certain way, it's like, at least on my part, it took a certain maturity.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's why, like in writing memoir, it's like what I always say is, in the beginning, just write it all out there. It's cathartic. Just write it out there, because you're not going to publish it. You're just getting it out. You're like, look. And there's it's healing. It's just healing.
And you were very young.
Journey.
Somebody asked, let's see, I know you said you were 20 when you were in the Marshall Islands, or how old were you when you were divorced? Do you remember?
32.
Okay. Somebody asked that. And this, Marjorie, it's just great to hear that, because you do the memoir writing classes and you have your website, which I'm putting in the chat, but it's Writer's Adventure. And I think you do just such a wonderful, supportive system of helping other writers. So unlike what your experience was at the writing conference.
Right. Yeah.
So and it takes a village, like you said, working with other writers, having others read your work and trying to filter out all this. And
unnecessary comments.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see the chat. I'm just reading some of these. yeah, I guess, so after writing this book, do you see any part of your life in a different light that you did when you lived it? That's
Sure.
really interesting.
Yes, and I think that's why I had so many drafts.
Mhm.
The average number of drafts that a memoir writer has is 6. That's a lot. That's a lot. And once you do it, you realize why. And then when you get other people to read it, and they, like Kate read mine, and one of the things she said, which, thank you, Kate, I had to do a whole new draft. But anyway, it was like,
That's good.
she said, well, you know, you didn't get my attention until the part where you had to evacuate your daughter from Kwajalein on an big air transport plane from Kwajalein out in the middle of nowhere, literally, to Honolulu. She said, that's when you caught my attention. It's like, oh my God. Because I had written all this stuff about, which I was attached to. And that's the thing, it's like, sometimes you have to look at that stuff it's like, oh, I've got to cut that. So I cut a part about where I was in high school and was a funeral singer. I sang for funerals, made money singing at funerals. Of course, now they have that movie, The Funeral Singer or The Wedding Singer. Anyway, Kate wasn't all that interested. It's like, she didn't like that. And I had spent so much time trying to make it a real scene, like, being in the church. And as it turned out, all the funerals I sang for were for babies. And anyway, I was attached. But she didn't feel it moved the story forward or something like that. And it's like, okay, I cut that and I started where she suggested, and I think it really helped the book. And that's the other thing, and I also, and you guys know this, and so many of you are writers and you know this. We say that writers have to have a thick skin. You just really do. And that's why they say, don't, give your manuscript to like your aunt or your best friend or anybody who, might not tell you the whole truth.
Right.
who might not be willing, like Kate was, to say, well, I don't know, I didn't really like that. So it's, it's important. It's important.
We have another question here that I'm sure a lot of people are interested in, about just writing about people that are still alive, like your ex-husband. I know you did change names in here, but do you want to talk about, like, is there any liability, or how do you write about people that are in your life in a memoir?
Well, a couple of things. Yes, first off, it is recommended that you change everybody's name, which I did. Except my name. And also that you, in the front of the book, and just about every memoir you'll read, it's kind of like in legalese, there's a clause that's supposed to get you out of trouble, get you out of jail. It's like, for writing this book, I relied on my journals, letters, and researched facts, as well as my own memory and recollection of events. I changed the names for most of the people in the book to protect their privacy, except those belonging to public figures. There's public figures in here, like Yoko Ono, what's his name, the billionaire.
Oh, Aristotle Onassis.
Yeah, Aristotle and Onassis are well-known figures like Betty Friedan or whatever. Otherwise, change the name. Of course, if those people whom you change the names you know, I have heard of this happening. They'll go in there and say, well, that's me you wrote about. You know, you better take that. No, that's not who. I didn't write about you. I only know of one person, actually in Albuquerque, whose brother wrote a memoir, and he talked about, and he didn't change the names. He talked about being molested by one of the Catholic priests there. The people were Catholic there in Albuquerque. And I mean, you know, they tried to sue him. And my friend and her family disowned him because he named, you know, they felt like they had been exposed in a really bad way. And you know, then there's that whole thing of like sexual whatever. It's like it's tricky ground there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's kind of what writers do. They deny any and that's the other thing though too. It's like, these are my memories. So if you ask your sister to read the book, she is not going to remember things the way you did. She's going to say, no, that's not how it happened. I was there. I remember that is not how it happened. So don't give it to family. You know, don't do it.
Yeah. And we've got a lot of really nice comments of how you teach your memoir classes, and that you've encouraged people to find their voice. And you can tell when we're reading this memoir that you have found your voice in here too. And it's very you and your memories, and it's your side of the story. Bunny asked, do we see your evolution from Southern Belle to feminism in the book? I would say definitely.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Most definitely.
And Charles says, I've not yet bought your book, but now I will. Your writing speaks well for you. I am particularly impressed by your description of exposure to children and mothers suffering from nuclear radiation explosion. Yes, in the Marshall Islands. And that's one of
that was a big chapter. That was a big chapter.
Mm-hmm. That's very
because it was, well, because I mean, my then husband was in the military, and that's why we were even there. So to learn about what the military had done in that part of the world and how it had wrecked the environment. And for example, they did the Navy removed all the inhabitants of Bikini Island atoll to another island, saying, you'll be able to go back in a few months. Well, it's been, you know, I don't know, 60 years, and they'll never be able to go back because it is still contaminated. We're talking nuclear, but it's contaminated. And, you know, it was just shocking. It's like, how could this be? How could this be? And the fact that in our introduction to quadrilline, nobody talked about that. You know, that wasn't common.
Yeah, you're a young mother with a baby and pregnant, you know, in this place. And then the way you have the dialogue with your husband, just kind of explaining, right, military, that's really,
no, they're safe. They're safe.
But that's a perfect way to do that, how you showed that. I mean, we can just tell by the dialogue.
Yes, exactly. It's like
the attitude was
this kind of reveals where he was coming from. And mind you, the thing for me, and I didn't read that, I was maybe going to read it, but there's a chapter called A Southern Belle Learns Who's Important. And how I was raised, which was in the church, is obviously in the schools too, but is that men are the important ones. And even the Bible says that in the creation story. I mean, you know, Eve was the bad one, and Adam, poor Adam. And then, you know, God was a man, and, you know, women were just an afterthought. So that was the environment. so I know in the first beauty contest that what I was in the you know how they do that question thing, those obnoxious questions. You know, I didn't name as my favorite person my high school music teacher, Mrs. Caulfield, who was a mentor for me and helped me in my singing and all that. And instead, I chose a man, my history teacher, whom I did admire and like very much. I wouldn't have considered saying Mrs. Caulfield because it was men that were important. They were the movers and shakers. Everybody knew that. It's like nobody questioned that, you know. So, you know, once I began to question, and I do bring that out in the beginning of the book, how one of my problems was that I asked too many questions. You're never going to be such and such because you asked, and girls shouldn't ask questions. Girls,
and that was the best part of it, that you were. Yeah.
You're just supposed to be pretty and smile and oh my God. And you know, so I did. And so marrying an older man, I was so happy that he was older. I mean, my family and his family were horrified that we were marrying because he was a Romanian and a damn Yankee. It's like, you have betrayed our family. A damn Yankee? Anyway, there's a funny, there's some funny chapters in there about that. But you know, funny now looking back, I mean, but anyway, a damn Yankee, it's a real thing, and it still is, actually.
That brings me to one of the questions I think, Jen, you asked earlier. How did do you think the traveling and just being a military wife helped?
Absolutely. It really opened my eyes because I've always, you know, been interested in other cultures. You know, I married a Romanian. My goodness, you know, I loved it, you know, hearing all his stories, and I assured his family I was going to learn to cook all those Romanian dishes. I never did, but you know, I aspired to that a little bit for a few minutes. But yeah, so the first thing, like I said, going to some place where, I mean, they worship sharks. It was sharks that led the Polynesians from Tahiti to Hawaii, for example. So a shark is an Aumakua, or their god. Stones, you know, they worship stones. That's one of, you know, you'll see stones at their heiaus, you know, where they would worship. It's like, oh my God. And so I definitely had a religious crises. And that's what led me to many conversations with the military chaplain there on Kwajalein, who was a Baptist, you know, which I was so grateful for. He's a Baptist. He's going to be scripture based and everything he tells me, and it's going to be true anyway.
Yeah, you've got a good, you share some of that too. And
yeah.
Pretty good. And I mean, there's so much going on in here, which is why it's so interesting. And I really like how you've got this into kind of sections and how you organized it. So, I mean,
thank you. Yeah,
great, you know, because it's like, where do you start sometimes when you're writing? Let's see, and I'm just going to the chat. Kate Padilla, I can spotlight you here.
Yay, Kate. Yay, Paul.
You were reviewing your book.
I wanted to make a couple of comments because Marjorie has mentioned my name a couple of times about reviewing books, reviewing manuscripts. When Marjorie first gave it to me, it was where I sat and said, okay, I review books professionally. So you got to tell me what you want. What are you expecting? And where do you want? And she goes, no, I want you to just go right to it. So then when I did, I thought, oh no, our friendship is over.
Right.
Risks there. There was some risk because then Marjorie, I can't write anymore. I'm not going to do it. Or whatever. I think it was all of a sudden it was
too much.
it was too much, the rewrite. And so, so when you do agree to review somebody's manuscript, you have to have a relationship with that person to say, how far do you want me to go?
Yes,
Or
good
how
point.
much do you want and what? But Marjorie told me to go full blown. And so what I did was read it page by page. Then I reread it and then gave her comments on first the general reaction as to how her story went. And so thank goodness she was still my friend after that. I just want to comment that I love the rewrite. I just reread the book and I loved it. Loved it.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you. Well, you noticed then that I did begin the story where you suggested. And the thing about that is, you know, in a memoir, when you change something more or less at the beginning, then that means you got to go through the whole, because it's a thread. And if you changed XYZ over here at the beginning, you're going to have to change XYZ somewhere else. So it's a task. And I always say, and I know people get tired of hearing this, but writing your memoir is a marathon, not a sprint. And that is so true. It's like, it's because you're going down a rabbit hole, you know, of your life. And it's like, you know, and I've had many people stop writing their memoir because they would get to places that, you know, where they were hurt or where maybe they did something that maybe they weren't proud of and they didn't want to write about that. And they said, no, I don't want to go there. That was too hurtful. I don't want to go back and even think about it anymore. And that's legitimate. That's legitimate. But, you know, so everybody has to decide if a memoir is something they want to write, because you could always make it a novel. Make it a novel. If, you know, if it's too painful, just, you know, create some additional characters, and then you can throw in things that didn't happen because you wish they had happened, maybe. So that's always a thing. But, you know, I really did appreciate Kate's input, and I knew that she was an editor of books, and her feedback was, I really valued, and it was, you know, I trusted her, and yeah, we're still friends. And then her husband piped in. It's like, well, you know, when I go to my bookshelf and look at books, you know, so Paul's whole thing, you want to tell that, Paul,
About the title.
about how you came to that?
With the subtitle?
Yeah, the subtitle.
When we have a big bookshelf here, and I'm always looking at the titles, and I see short titles, but then there's all these word subtitles below, and I kind of always like alliteration, and I couldn't resist all of those B's, and all of a sudden, how could you have all of these B's in your life, which are actually part of the only one that you didn't include in there was babies, but that was in
Right.
and so it just seemed like it all kind of came together with all of those B words, and I was pleasantly surprised that it actually materialized there in print.
Yeah, well, I took what you said. It's like, I know that's how I am too. Titles matter, and
Yeah.
and
So
those
good.
of you who write poetry or whatever it is you write, it's like, you gotta get that title. And so one of the things in memoir class is start a file with titles that come to you while you're showering or whatever. It's just write them down, and you'll have pages maybe of titles. And, you know, my memoir had many different titles along the way.
Mhm.
It started out to be, thank you, Eve, for I think it was, thank you, Eve, for eating the apple. To acknowledge, all the women who have dared to fuck you, I'm eating the apple, okay? I like the apple, the way it looks, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm having
And then-
Denise pop in there too, just because
Yeah,
title.
well, one of the things with
important, right.
Denise and that long title was, Denise, will that fit on the front of the book?
Well, Marjorie made the cover design easy.
Also struck
She
me.
had this wonderful photo of her. And to me, she looked like this young, sort of dissatisfied, really well-dressed Southern Belle in Paris. I mean, she was wearing this wonderful coat, and you could really sense the time. But your expression on your face was somebody who was looked like someone who was struggling, and so it was just such a provocative photo. And I thought I could bring it out. We played around with trying to use the photo itself, but I felt like I could bring out more the character by actually drawing it and changing it and providing the background there of the Paris, more recognizable Paris scenes. So yeah, and just knowing Marjorie, because this is the third book I've worked on with her, and I want to read the next volume. I know that you didn't. You
Yeah.
only got to the first couple
Yeah,
decades
no
of
doubt.
your adult life.
So we're gonna wrap it up here shortly, but yeah, we've got questions in here. Well, so talk about when's the next one out, and then also, are you doing any writing classes? I think you're doing one online. If you could mention that, or anywhere else like Paris, Taos, Hawaii. Any thoughts?
Well, we did just finish COVID more or less. And the place I wanted to do the a writing retreat here in Hawaii has been more or less closed off. It's like the most remote part of the island. It's called Hana, for those of you who've been over here. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And it's just too much. It's like organizing all that so Hawaii is down the road. I just felt like I was doing this book, trying to get that out there, and to organize the writing retreat for this spring. It's like, and that's, and maybe, I think creative people suffer from this, which is, you have a lot of things you're interested in because you're creative and you want to do a lot of things. And so, like I always say in teaching memoir, is you're going to have to take some things off the table, because you're not going to be able to do all these things that you've got on your table unless you do. And of course, then I had to follow my own advice. So yes, I am doing a memoir class, and I'm pretty excited about it because there's a new trend now in memoir writing called hybrid memoir. And that's where there's several different interpretations, but that's where, for example, you would take essays that you've written about different episodes or things that happened in your life, and then you would combine those rather than write it in any kind of a timeline per se. Because how I've been teaching memoir is like you're writing a novel. So you have act 1, act 2, act 3. So act 1 would be, what's the setting? How did it all start? And then, as we know, in act 2, that's where most of the action is. And then act 3, that's where you resolve all the conflict. So that's pretty much the template or structure, and it's good. But a lot of people struggle with that. And it's easier for them to just write an essay on some topic and, you know, an event from their life, and then move on to another event in their life, and then combine it in a way that flows like you do in a book of poetry. You know, it has to flow. So we'll be looking at that in this class too. So it will be a month from today, actually, March 19th. It'll be online, Zoom, six sessions.
Okay. So March 19th, is that a Sunday? I haven't looked at my calendar.
It'll be 6 Sundays,
Okay.
every other Sunday, so that people have time to write. But yeah, on Sundays.
Okay, and we'll put, I'll put your website in the chat again, but it's writersadventure.com, so that any of our people watching this can check that out, and we'll post it up there too. And we'll, as soon as we know, we'll spread the word.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And then your books, I also wanted to just to mention, you have 2 books on memoir writing, the wild women write, that reconnecting with the wild feminine, and then rites of passage. So those are also available, and I think they're excellent for trying to generate some of those stories.
They really are, especially the rites of passage, because it does go through the seasons of your life.
Mhm.
So it's aimed at, you know, when you're young, you do the childhood, then you do the young adult, then the older adult, and then the old person. Like some of the things in there, for example, and some of you who've taken those classes, it's like, what do you want it to read on your tombstone? Or are you going to be not burned, what do they call it? Incinerated? When you
Cremated.
get your ashes, whatever that is. In other words,
Okay.
you're older, you're a crone, you're like, what's it going to look like? What do you know, anyway, thinking about those kind of things. So yes, it is a lot of good writing that can be incorporated into a memoir. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So well, it's too short. We could go on and on, but I am going to stop the recording soon here. And then we'll hang around later if people want to chat informally, they can. And I just want to thank everybody, and I'm hoping I spotlighted everybody. Is there anybody here, Marjorie, that you want to make sure? I know Andy's here. I don't know if you want to say anything, Andy, and did a lot of editing.
Well, I was
there,
interested
and-
in, as I said, is Ellen Gransard here from Paris? Ellen Grant, she lives in Paris.
Yeah,
She
she's
signed
not
up.
here, unless
Okay,
not
well.
on a name, unless there's a couple of people on phones. So, but yeah, so it just thank you everybody for attending, and it's just great inspiration. You're very inspiring.
Well, thank you, Jules and John. John, you want to chime in on something?
Just wonderful, and thanks everybody for joining in
Yes,
here.
absolutely. I'm very, very touched. Look, I bought a lei just for this, so I can inspire everybody. Get your butts on over here to Hawaii and let's have some fun. Come on, you
I
can
was
do it.
saying,
We'll figure out something.
I was saying earlier, we need that Hawaiian sunshine. We have an uncharacteristically dismal day here in Albuquerque. So you brought some
Great.
sunshine to
And
us.
yes, it's been sunshine, and just really nice to have you here. So I'm going to stop recording.